What do you think you'll be remembered for as governor in
Gosh.
terms of your state activities?
Well, I know what I'd like to be remembered for, and that's not your question, of course. What I'd like to be remembered for is that in the time I was there, we did fundamentally change the formula for for distribution of dollars to education and take on a healthcare budget and distribution system that didn't work and begin a system of economic revitalization for upstate that was meaningful. Now, those are the three substantive issues that mattered most to me. Obviously, what I will be remembered for, only time will tell.
Given the climate in Albany, can any governor accomplish fundamental change in the way that Albany does business?
Yes, but it will be messy, and it will require a certain forcefulness and tact, a combination and a duality of temperament and approach that requires a very fine calibration. Obviously, when I was governor, people played and gave more ink to the tension that was very real between me and a Republican Senate that, without any question, was standing in the way of reform, and I made the judgment that we needed to sort of push through them in a very aggressive way, get the majority, and it worked in some ways, didn't work in others. But I think you need both the forcefulness and steadfastness to take on very significant groups that do not want to see reform, and yet the tact to put together the majority, 50+1 in each house, to get there.
Was there a governor that you wanted to emulate that was sort of a role model for you?
Well, Rockefeller was a great governor in terms of building and putting together great aspirations and great images for the state. There's now a belief that the fiscal condition of the state in the years thereafter did not really match the economic reality of the times, and he set us on a path that in the long run hasn't worked. On the other hand, he had great aspirations and he was a great builder. And to a certain extent, New York is a state that lives on the great dreams and building those dreams, and we figure out a way to make it all work at the end somehow. And so Rockefeller was a great governor. Carey, of course, dealt with a crisis by bringing sort of the leadership team together and getting that mutuality of public purpose to dominate over individual interests at the moment of fiscal crisis. And so that, of course, right now would have been the image that one would invoke.
You left out another fellow Democrat.
Who was that?
Mario Cuomo.
Oh. Well, look, Governor Cuomo was a spectacular governor in terms of his intellectual leadership of the state, and will be remembered for his oratorical skills. And I say this not to diminish his administration of the state. I think it's harder to see a specific substantive accomplishment in terms of the SUNY system or physical development that he leaves behind, and he may bridle at that, but I don't think I'm speaking beyond the sort of traditional take on his administration.
When you talked about what it takes to be a governor, what it takes to have an effect, as you sort of indicated, it's a different skill set to some extent from being a prosecutor, from
Sure
being an attorney general.
Sure.
What are the difference in those two things, and can you bridge them? Obviously, you recognize the fact that a lot of people thought, at least early on, you couldn't in dealing with the Senate, even dealing with fellow Democrats in the Assembly.
Right. Well, look, the differences are easily stated. As a prosecutor, you are a unitary decision maker. You look at the facts, you interpret the law, make a determination to proceed with a litigation. Of course, you have a grand jury and then a jury whom you have to persuade, but initiating the case, which is the critical threshold, is a unitary decision. You don't need to forge the coalition of interests as you do as governor. So emotionally very different, and there is the bright line distinction, right and wrong, that is what prosecutors look at, rather than the more subtle issues of distributing dollars in ways that necessitate compromise, et cetera, which is the more substantial role of the governor. So yes, fundamentally different approaches, and without veering into the question of whether I, when I was governor, properly mediated that difference, and I would tell you that we understood the difference, we were mediating it in different ways in different places. Sometimes you have to be tough, such as when the legislature simply ignored the public interest and spoke exclusively to its legislative interest in holding on to ownership of the controller's position. Not a slight of Tom DiNapoli necessarily, but they cared about their institutional purpose, not the public interest, and that's why we came to loggerheads. Mm-hmm. So be it. Can some people mediate these effectively? Of course. And If in fact Andrew is the next governor, I wish him all the best at doing so.
Do you think he can? What advice would you give him in terms of mediating the two different positions, the two different skill sets?
Well, Andrew will have an easy time, I think, dealing with the politics of the legislature. He grew up there. And in fact, his DNA, one would argue, comes very much out of that cauldron of Albany politics. Of course, during his dad's tenure, he was very much at the epicenter of decision-making, running the apparatus of government. And I think he will argue that that gives him the unique skill set to continue in that mission. I think the question will be, will he take on the interests who are deeply embedded in the structure of Albany to confront both fiscal and economic development issues in a way that will put us on a fundamentally different trajectory. And some of those battles are very difficult and require some difficult conversations with groups who have had significant say in Albany over the years.
He always comes across as a tough guy, sometimes too much of a tough guy.
Right.
Why would you even doubt that he would have the toughness to do that?
No, it's not. Well, it's a question of, will you take on groups who have been critical political supporters? And toughness is not the issue. It's easy to be tough if the selection of one's targets is driven by politics. The real test is, do you take on the battles that are both unpopular and perhaps seem impossible to win at one point, but may be important to take on?
Like healthcare?
Such as healthcare, and that was quite a kerfuffle when I was in my first budget, where others had wanted to reach accords and agreement with the interest involved there. Joe had an understanding with 1199 that was mutually beneficial and certainly created a healthcare system that worked, but was just expensive in a way that I felt was not sustainable and was not reaching critical pockets of our population. So when we decided to transform that, it set off quite a brouhaha. And we did accomplish what others had not tried to do in the past number of years and redirect the dollars. And time will tell whether we did it successfully or not. And of course, we were going to cover 400,000 kids, do many of the things, in fact, that became part of the Obama healthcare plan. But one of the fundamental pieces for us was we were redirecting dollars away from some of the private academic institutions towards municipal hospitals in order to reach a broader base, and that had implications that not everybody was thrilled with.
Andrew probably has a closer relationship with 1199 than even Joe Bruno did.
He certainly begins with a good, close relationship with 1199, which is good, and they're a wonderful organization who fight with tremendous effectiveness for their membership. Interestingly, I disagreed with Dennis Rivera about where healthcare dollars should go, never challenged the fact that he was a brilliant union leader, because his interest was his membership. And on behalf of his membership, he did a spectacular job, creating not only a political backdrop that permitted him to get where he wanted to go, but then also dealing and playing his cards to apply pressure on others whose interests theoretically should not have been in pure alignment with his.
So what did you learn about the difference between the two jobs? Once you had both, you were one of the very few people
Right.
who was in both.
Well,
As Cuomo might.
Intellectually, you understand the differences going in. Transforming one's behavior to accommodate those differences is not always as easy as one might wish, but you live and learn as things go along. President Obama in his first year, I think, has gone through this from a slightly different side, not the prosecutor to executive difference, but the battle internally over how accommodating to be with the legislature. And in fact, he began by being, some would have said in the first year, some have said, too accommodating, and now has gone very much the other way. I began perhaps by not being accommodating enough, but I would argue we needed to, and again, these are issues of subtlety that we can debate forever.
You said at one point you have to fight those battles with humility and constant introspection.
Right. Easier said than done.
I'll bet it is. You were one of the first people in 2002 to endorse Carl McCall. Why Carl McCall over Andrew Cuomo in that race?
I actually thought that Carl would have been a very good governor and had the values, the expertise, new state government had, and I don't put great stock in, he's been there, therefore he deserves it. I did not climb up the ladder. I jumped rungs and people were hesitant about that. So it's not because he's been there, therefore. He had a temperament, he had an understanding, he had a presence, he had a judgment. I thought he was just a good person.
And what about Andrew at the time?
Yeah, look, Andrew and I, and this has been well chronicled, he and I have had some disagreements. And it goes back to the very first effort when I was Attorney General and we were involved in lengthy negotiations with gun companies and were reasonably close to a resolution that could have been transformative in terms of the way guns were sold, the whole pipeline of distribution. And Andrew then jumped in at the last minute and, in my view, undercut the investigation. What he put together was grabbed the headlines, but then went nowhere and did not accomplish anything. And then when we went back to the federal government and said, look, here's some other things you might be able to do, they did not come along.
Every one of the people we interviewed for this series used the word matured, referring to Andrew Cuomo. I read them a column from Bob Herbert in 2002. If Andrew Cuomo doesn't acknowledge that his arrogant, abrasive, controlling, even mean-spirited qualities played a big role in his defeat by Carl McCall, then he won't bother to improve them. His political career is doomed.
Right.
Has he matured?
Look, we all mature, and so I am sure he has. And he went through a patch, which you wouldn't wish on anybody, where many pieces of his life were not at a point where he was happy, no doubt. And I hope he matured. You wish that for anybody. And look, I've seen, no mystery, I've seen peaks and valleys. And if you don't come out the other end with some greater degree of sensibility about both what you did and how you got there, then it'd be rare indeed if you didn't mature.
Do you think you've matured?
You know, I hope so. You know, I certainly hope so. I'm not sure I can answer the question. I think others will have to make that determination. I think so, and one hopes.
How was he done as Attorney General? It's an office you were in, you know it, the workings of it, you know some of the people who occupied it.
Look, I've tried hard not to pass judgment. So I'll be a little circumspect. I think that there is still a little bit of a gap between the headlines and the reality in some of the areas of pursuit. The issues relating to Wall Street, for instance, some of the areas where more intervention and deeper intervention, by which I mean more granular, harder work that would have taken a bit more time and would have been a bit more disruptive, frankly, to Wall Street, would have been important. The rating agency issue, for instance, is one that got headlines but did not change anything. The issue of bonuses, where he's put out some reports, which is information gathering, but then didn't pursue the one case where the office actually had jurisdiction. Arguably, there were other cases, but the one where we had unambiguous jurisdiction, which was the Grasso pay issue, where he didn't appeal an aberrant, and I use this word advisedly, an aberrant appellate division case that simply needed to have been appealed. He had an automatic right of appeal. He should have done it. He didn't. And that's deeply troubling to me, because that is a case where an executive in a not-for-profit was paid $140 million. The facts, as put together by, in the Webb report, Dan Webb, the former U.S. Attorney in Chicago, are appalling, and we pursued it. But there was a political pushback on that one, as everybody knows. It affected some very powerful people, and we had pursued it, and we're right to do so. And so I have some issues with areas like that, but again,
You're choosing your words very carefully, but what does it say, given the tough image and the toughness that would be required by him as governor if he didn't take on some of these cases?
We'll see. And I think that's, again, I don't want to start second guessing. I'm not in a place to start second guessing. I think if Andrew is governor, he's going to have to make tough decisions in the domains of healthcare and education in particular, where our fiscal condition doesn't meet our aspirations right now. And I've often thought to myself, it's a good thing to have that gap, in the sense that we would never want our aspirations to be so limited that we can accomplish everything we want. But right now there's a yawning divide between what we can pay for and what we want to do, and that calls for very tough decisions.
And tough decisions involving people who have been political allies of him.
Correct. Now, come back to it. When I was running, you will note the endorsement I got from 1199. I'm not even sure there ever was an endorsement. If it was there, it was a very muted sort of a press release issued Friday night at 10 o'clock. because they knew from our conversations all during the campaign that the healthcare paradigm that we were pushing was not the one that they necessarily wanted.
How do you think he would be different from his father as governor? You've seen them both.
Oh, look, again, I don't want to get into that swamp, but I think his dad is acknowledged to be not only one of the most brilliant orators and deepest thinkers that we've had on the political stage in many years. I don't think Andrew aspires to be that. I think Andrew aspires to be somebody of action. And so I think that they come at it from different perspectives.
Let me ask you about two things in the Elkin book, if I can.
Which I have not read, by the way. So.
Well, okay, so I'll read it to you.
The whole book?
No, just this part. After the report came out on so-called Troopergate, Mr. Cuomo threatened to reopen his investigation if the governor's staff criticized him. Andrew, you better be careful how you phrase things, Mr. Spitzer said he told the Attorney General. In layman's terms, that would be called extortion.
Right.
So did
Andrew then denied having said that.
Did you say that to Peter Elkin?
Yes.
So that incident took place?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. There's no question. Look, the backdrop was that Andrew, and again, I can't say what he thought, obviously, but the report came out, and as I read it a few days later, I realized it was actually deeply flawed, both in its factual recitation and its legal conclusions. Put that aside. When there arose the moment when we began to say some things challenging the conclusions of the report, he got very upset. And that's when this conversation occurred, and he had it with other people as well. So
what does that say about Andrew Cuomo? That he,
well, look,
in layman's terms, that would be called extortion?
Right. Well, I was trying to say to him, look, be careful. When you're the Attorney General, you're in a position where words, President Obama gave a great speech, words matter. And I think Deval Patrick gave that speech beforehand, but that's okay. Words do matter and have to be used with care. And I was trying to say to him, actually in a friendly way, be cautious about how you have this conversation and think it through more carefully. I'm the last person to say that in moments of anger or pique, we don't say things that we would like to take back. We've all had those conversations, and you know, my view is that every one of those that I've had has ended up being reported somewhere else, so be it. But I was trying to say to him, look, think this through.
Well, how does that clash with the notion that he's matured, if he would be that threatening?
You know, look, I'm not going to spend my time going to great lengths to defend him, but don't take one conversation as being the primary point of evidence of somebody's psyche. And I think that is the frustration that, I'll give you a reference point. Politicians these days, I won't speak for everybody, I began to feel that since every word is recorded, uttered, and listened to, the worst ones become the media focus, and therefore you're judged by your lowest moments, rather than, it's not fair to expect to be judged by your highest moments either, but rather than the mass of what you do. Mm-hmm. There was in the public editor's column of the Times a few Sundays ago, a little conversation about the webcasting that you had and how one or two comments, which were, you know, poorly chosen, where the words were poorly chosen, caused a little bit of consternation. And I think when I read it, I said, aha, now the folks there are beginning to appreciate what it's like
it's not
as
just
a politician. That's right, where every word can suddenly become the focal point instead of the larger narrative of what you're trying to do. And so I wouldn't use this one incident with Andrew as dispositive proof of anything. It happened, it's there, you acknowledge it and you move on.
Let me ask you just about one other quote from the book, which you haven't read, so I'll read it again. Yeah. Mr. Spitzer says that Mr. Cuomo does not know light from dark.
Right, at that moment, with respect to those conversations, he was protecting what I viewed, the Troopergate report, to be a political document rather than trying to figure out what really happened. And I think I've been very clear about this. That incident, no matter what one may think, and I don't pretend to know with any greater precision than anybody else, what Darren Dobbs did to gather that data about Joe Bruno's use of the plane, which is sort of a footnote to a footnote to a footnote in terms of things we should really care about. But it became an issue of such enormity because Andrew wrote a report that was designed to entirely whitewash one side of it and tee up the other side as a major issue. And he lost all sense of both proportion. I think it was driven by politics.
One of the things that Andrew's been criticized for is not speaking up enough on non-Attorney General issues, particularly the budget crisis facing the state. Is that an obligation of his at this point, before he announces his candidacy?
Well, I think I could argue it. Yes, at this point he's really a candidate, and everybody knows that he's raised a few dollars here and there to run for governor. So I think at this point the notion that he's not a candidate is a little bit of a fiction that's hard to maintain. Having said that, I think the issue will disappear shortly enough because he's going to have to answer those questions, and I think the media will descend upon him when the starting gun goes off and says, okay, and say to him, okay, Andrew, now you can't hide behind that veil anymore. What are your answers on these 35 tough issues, and explain them. At that point, his strategy may very well be to be as opaque as possible, on the theory that till November he wants to maintain his options, and he doesn't have a tough race, presumably, so therefore maintaining options is not a bad strategy from his perspective, so you guys will set upon him and do your thing.
Do our thing. Emily? Emily? Oh, where is Emily? Oh, there you are. I'm sorry. I can't see with the light.
Maybe you can just discuss a little bit more about how Andrew is as a politician. He's going to have to make the leap from unilateral decision maker to more of a consensus.
And also, unlike you or unlike Rudy Giuliani, he does have the political background. He ran his father's campaigns. He saw it firsthand. He was at HUD, arguably.
Well, the difficulty for him will not be living in the political environment. That he has done for, I would say, all of his life. The difficulty will be, will he figure out how to overcome institutional interests, whether it is the legislative interest in maintaining prerogatives that it feels it owns, either constitutionally or by dint of tradition, that he will feel the executive needs in order to effectuate policies, or to overcome interests of whether it's the business groups or union leaders or civic leaders who are very set in their ways. He will need to take them on in a very determined way.
And is he too political in that sense to do that?
I don't know if the issue is his being too political. I think the issue is, will he have the stomach to pick political fights or to pick fights that have very negative political consequences.
He didn't mind picking one with you.
Well, but that arguably didn't have negative political consequences in terms of what his motivation was. Again, I don't want to dig into that, but I think it is not by happenstance that virtually every governor in the nation has numbers that are extraordinarily low. People who are very good politicians and very appealing figures. Arnold Schwarzenegger's numbers are in the 20s. Bev Perdue, who's a charming woman, elected governor of North Carolina last November, I think by March her numbers were down in the 20s or 30s. Deval Patrick up in Massachusetts, again, Massachusetts being Massachusetts, Deval Patrick had very, very tough political issues, still does. Ted Strickland in Ohio. Mm-hmm. So you see this across party lines. I was about to say Charlie Crist in Florida, that may be a slightly different issue at this point, but anybody in the nation who's a governor, when the gap between revenues and desired expenditures is so enormous, as I've always said, positive-sum games, we can all look like heroes. Zero-sum games are okay. Negative-sum games are a disaster for executives, and that's where governors are. The president doesn't have that problem. The president can run up biggest deficits in the history of one's imagination
and justify them.
And he's probably right. And Mitt Romney's looking at it, saying, "Oh my goodness, do I want this job?" So. I think the answer is, well, I didn't grow up in the morning or wake up in the morning saying, boy, my political skills are the ones I care most deeply about. But I'm going to sort of turn into a sort of more metaphysical question for you. It depends how you define who's a better politician. What do you mean by politics in that way? I'd like to think that I was a pretty good politician in the sense of having the desire to see what issues really mattered over the long haul, framing those issues in a way such the public understood them, communicating my message. I mean, I did win by an okay margin in '06
Yes,
and in
indeed.
'02, and I snuck by in '98 on the tails of Carl McCall and Chuck Schumer, you know, if you look at the ballot, and managed to explain to the public over 8.5 years what we were doing and why. And so, you know, I did okay, but I'm not going to, you know, I'm not going to write my obituary yet.
This year, will you vote for Andrew Cuomo?
You know, I'm not saying that this statement could be misinterpreted no matter what. I don't know who the candidates are going to be. I think it's fair to presume he will be the Democratic nominee. I do want to see who else is in the race, and I don't say that to slight him. He hasn't answered the hard questions yet about how he will govern the state, and so I think it's fair for everybody to say, let's wait and see.
Great.
Yeah.
All right, my pleasure.